Yesterday's indictment of James Comey was more than another political headline. It was the moment when a metaphor hardened into reality, when a spectre long invoked from the podium was made flesh in a courtroom. For years, the president has railed against a deep state, a hidden cabal inside the Justice Department working to undermine him. At first, this was story more than fact, a label for frustration, a way to explain resistance. But power acted as if it were real, purging attorneys, silencing prosecutors, bending rules to strip away independence. Each purge produced dissent. Each act of dissent was read as conspiracy, and so the deep state became what paranoia required it to be, not a secret order of plotters, but a pattern of repression turned back upon itself. To see how this works, it helps to borrow a metaphor from fiction. In J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, Voldemort's paranoia hollowed out the Ministry of Magic and Hogwarts of honest leadership, driving young witches and wizards into a hidden fellowship known as Dumbledore's Army. That army was never created by rebellion alone. It was imagined first by power itself, a fear that opposition must be organizing in secret. Once authorities criminalized self-defense and punished independent judgment, that phantom began to take form. The act of repression conjured the very resistance it feared. So too here. If we reinterpret Trump's deep state through the lens of Rowling's story, the parallel becomes clear. What he calls conspiracy is closer to Comey's army, a phantom force that exists first in the imagination of power, then takes shape only because repression leaves no other path. The Justice Department of 2025, like the ministry in Rowling's tale, became the stage where paranoia created the very enemy it claimed to fight. This is why we tell the story as a legend. Legends make patterns visible. They show how suspicion becomes purge, purge becomes resistance, resistance becomes myth, and myth is mistaken for reality. Over the months that follow, we trace that cycle through firings and reassignments, whistleblowers and resignations, raids and indictments, until the phantom of Comey's army stood named and real, not because it was plotted in secret rooms, but because it was conjured by decree. And so our story begins in the shadowed halls of February 2025, where suspicion was already driving command, and command was already creating the very instability it claimed to fight. In February 2025, the Justice Department was thrown into upheaval when President Trump ordered the termination of every remaining Biden-era U.S. attorney. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of fudge forcing out anyone who dared to whisper Voldemort's name, a show of authority designed less to solve a problem than to make denial enforceable. Within days, termination letters were dispatched, thin slips that carried the weight of decree. The exodus spread quickly. Nearly two-thirds of the federal programs branch announced departures by July, just as the ministry's auras and examiners began disappearing under scrutiny or reassignment when their loyalty was questioned. The Civil Rights Division, once a proud bulwark, saw 70% of its staff gone through resignations and forced transfers, echoing the hollowing of entire ministry departments that looked intact from the outside but had been drained of independent judgment. Then came February's Thursday night massacre, when 7 prosecutors resigned rather than abandon corruption charges against New York Mayor Eric Adams. It was the echo of those who chose principal at Hogwarts, professors who quietly refused Umbridge's decrees or vanished rather than enforce them. Even the head of the criminal division in Washington walked away, invoking constitutional duty, a gesture as stark as those few at the ministry who resigned rather than become functionaries of denial. The halls do not go silent all at once. At DOJ first came the notices, then the transfers to nowhere rooms and temporary task forces with no dockets, like Umbridge's invented inspections and committees, designed to sideline the competent while rewarding the compliant. Doors that once opened on real cases now opened on pep talks about loyalty. At the ministry too, it became dangerous to improvise, safer to parrot the line than to exercise judgment. By mid-year, attrition approached calamity, empty chairs in conference rooms, names scrubbed from directories. The building still stood, as the Ministry of Magic had, its marble facades intact. But both had become shadows of themselves, institutions where loyalty eclipsed law, and where silence was proof of survival. Early in 2025, pressure on prosecutors to pursue political targets became unmistakable. On February 18th, senior prosecutor Eric Siebert resigned after resisting demands to bring charges against New York Attorney General Letitia James without sufficient evidence. The next day, the White House insisted he had been fired. It was not unlike the moment Hogwarts professors were told to stop teaching spells and start teaching slogans. A turning point when the very act of practicing one's craft was redefined as disobedience. Around the same time, DOJ leadership created a weaponization working group to comb through past prosecutions and enforce new standards of conformity. It had the feel of Umbridge's inquisitorial squad, empowered not to teach or to serve, but to police and intimidate, measuring loyalty by recitation rather than competence. Policy changes on corporate enforcement and bribery, rolled out in the spring and summer, further centralized discretion in Washington. These were not unlike the decrees posted on Hogwarts's walls, each one narrowing what could be taught, what could be said, until even silence was suspect. Meanwhile, seasoned attorneys were quietly reassigned to a newly minted Sanctuary Cities Enforcement Unit, widely understood inside DOJ as bureaucratic exile. The gesture echoed the way loyalist students were rewarded with titles and badges, while principled teachers were banished from classrooms. What once was discretion had become doctrine. What once was education had become indoctrination. They do not outlaw independence by name. They rename it alignment, consistency, message discipline. The memos arrive as guidance, the slide decks as best practices. Case selection is no longer tested against evidence, but measured against narrative coherence. A new catechism circulates: read the talking points, recite the creed, do not improvise. To exercise judgment is to raise suspicion. To decline a shaky charge is to invite review. One line breaks the surface. A US attorney leaves rather than be the hand that points a prosecution at a political adversary, and a day later, the world is told he was fired. A new office within the office is announced to comb the past for weaponization, then points forward to decide what counts as conformity. Policy circulars on corporate enforcement and bribery arrive with a steady cadence, promising continuity, practicing centralization. Senior attorneys who once carried major matters find themselves redirected to a Sanctuary Cities enforcement project that feels like a storage room with a shingle. Independence is preserved in the letter. In the spirit, it is filed. At Hogwarts, this was the year defense against the dark arts was reduced to theory, wands were forbidden, and practice itself was criminalized. At DOJ, it was the same lesson written in another alphabet. Those who sought to exercise judgment were accused of disloyalty, and those who refused to bend became the proof that paranoia had been right all along. By March 2025, the strategy of sidelining had become unmistakable. Senior attorneys were quietly reassigned into a Sanctuary Cities enforcement working group that carried little real work. It was exile disguised as assignment, like the Hogwarts professors shuffled from classrooms to invented posts when they refused to toe Umbridge's line. But where power hoped for silence, conscience began to gather. Senate committees opened inquiries into the Inspector General firings and the wave of reassignments. Whispers of resistance were beginning to reach the surface. In April, resistance stepped into open daylight. On April 2nd, federal judge Dale Ho dismissed United States v. Adams with prejudice, rejecting DOJ's rationale and blocking any attempt to revive the case. His ruling carried the same defiant clarity as Dumbledore's refusal to be cowed in the ministry's atrium, a simple insistence that law was not theater and evidence was not optional. Just weeks later, 3 more prosecutors, Celia V. Cohen, Andrew Rohrbach, and Derek Wickstrom, resigned rather than endorse the rationale that had already collapsed in court. At the same time, DOJ attorney Erez Ruveni filed a whistleblower complaint with the Senate Judiciary Committee, detailing internal directives to mislead courts and delay compliance with orders. It was a modern equivalent of the first student slipping away to the room of requirement, sworn not by oath but by necessity, documenting what was forbidden so that it could not be erased. Each disclosure became a spell in its own right, dry, technical, yet powerful enough to pierce the facade. By May, the attrition was undeniable. Reports confirmed that more than 70% of the Civil Rights Division had been lost to resignations or reassignments, a devastation as sweeping as the hollowing of Hogwarts' defense against the dark arts, where the art of defense was reduced to silence. Even as Main Justice announced new corporate enforcement policies, consolidating discretion at the top, former prosecutors on the outside gathered in open letters and public forums. More than 900 signed their names, calling for law to remain above politics. Some say it began with the refusals, the resignation letters in tidy serif fonts, the motions that insisted on proof, the disclosures bundled with statutes instead of slogans. But the truth is that Comey's army began to take shape the moment the Black Hand tried to seize control of justice. Not in form yet, but in the imagination of power. It was the president himself who conjured it into being, declaring that disloyalty lurked within, that an invisible faction was plotting his undoing. Every act of resistance thereafter, a resignation here, a ruling there, was read not as conscience, but as confirmation. And this is the paradox at the heart of the pattern. Paranoia demands control. Control corrodes independence. Independence, once corrupted, turns into defiance. Defiance, forced underground, begins to look exactly like conspiracy. The suspicion that set the cycle in motion returns at the end, appearing vindicated, not because it was true, but because it was acted upon. What began as illusion becomes symbol. What was symbol begins to gather the outlines of reality. This is the psychology of Comey's army. In the eyes of power, it does not matter that these prosecutors and judges did not meet in secret to plot. What matters is that they acted on their oaths rather than on command, and in doing so gave shape to the very phantom arrayed against them. It is Dumbledore's army reborn in another register. Young witches and wizards gathering in secret to practice forbidden defense, not because they were rebels first, but because they were told defense itself was forbidden. The army was not founded in rebellion. It was born in the imagination of authority and made inevitable by its own repression. So too here. The underground did not announce itself with banners. It announced itself with silence, broken in carefully chosen words, with departures noted only in resignation letters, with rulings that insisted on evidence. These were not soldiers yet, but in the mind of power, the battalions were already drawn. By June, dissent no longer unfolded in open resignations alone, it moved into hidden channels. On June 9th and 10th, Main Justice circulated new FCPA enforcement guidelines, consolidating power over corporate prosecutions in Washington. Another decree, another narrowing. 2 weeks later, on June 24th, former DOJ lawyer Erez Ruveni filed a protected disclosure with the Senate Judiciary Committee, alleging pressure to mislead courts and to defy injunctions. His packet moved like contraband cover sheets invoking federal law as a shield, testimony written in legal code rather than rebellion. Each was the equivalent of a Dumbledore's army sign-up sheet, dry on its face, incendiary in its purpose. Attrition continued to accelerate. Reassignments stacked up, departures mounted in key divisions. By July 14th, Reuters reported that nearly 2/3 of the federal programs branch had left since January. Empty desks became the most visible proof of the invisible war. At Hogwarts too, it was the absence of trusted professors, the sudden silences in corridors that told students the real story. Oversight offered another hidden venue. On July 1st, the DOJ Inspector General issued a management advisory on misuse of restraints in Bureau of Prisons facilities, followed later that month by a full audit on July 29th. Dry documents, footnoted and restrained, yet as luminous in their own way as the galleons enchanted to summon DA members to their meetings. They said what others could not say aloud. Something is wrong, and it is recorded here. Meanwhile, the shadow lengthened further. On July 8th through 10th, news broke that DOJ had opened investigations into former CIA Director John Brennan and former FBI Director James Comey over their roles in the Russia probe origins. In the imagination of power, the enemy was no longer diffuse. It had names, faces, dossiers. In the imagination of resistance, the naming was proof that their worst fears were coming true. In both readings, the Phantom Army was no longer just a rumor. No oaths under candlelight, no secret passphrases. The room of requirement is an encrypted thread, a Senate Dropbox, a locked draft in a personal drive titled, "So boring no one will click it." They convene in CLE panels and faculty lounges, in pro bono clinics and oversight briefings. The rights are modern, metadata scrubbed, PDFs redacted, footnotes sharpened like knives. On July 31st, more than 1,300 former DOJ officials signed a public statement condemning the intimidation of government lawyers. It was not a battle cry, but it carried the sound of one. At Hogwarts, the room of requirement filled with young witches and wizards practicing what they had been told was forbidden. At DOJ, the classrooms and bar associations filled with lawyers explaining, in the driest possible language, how to resist unlawful orders while remaining lawful themselves. These were not soldiers yet, but the army was no longer imaginary. By August 2025, fractures inside the Justice Department were no longer hidden. Internal memoranda branded dissenters as politicized or tainted. Threats of misconduct inquiries circulated, and networks of colleagues began to fray. These were the proclamations on the wall. Quiet notices meant to isolate, stigmatize, and remind every lawyer that judgment itself was now dangerous. But paper threats were only the beginning. On August 2nd, the U.S. Office of Special Counsel opened an investigation into former Special Counsel Jack Smith, accusing him of Hatch Act violations. It was a show trial in all but name a high-profile proceeding designed not to adjudicate, but to discredit. Like Harry's sudden summons before the full Wizengamot, the charge mattered less than the performance of authority. 9 days later came confirmation that the probe remained ongoing, the drip of suspicion that functions like the Daily Prophet's steady drumbeat against Dumbledore and Harry. The message was not in the detail, but in the repetition. The accused remain under shadow, and therefore the danger must be real. Then, escalation. On August 22nd, FBI agents executed search warrants at John Bolton's home and office, seizing classified documents but filing no charges. This was no quiet memo. It was a midnight raid meant to humiliate, a public spectacle staged for effect. It echoed the ministry's most theatrical displays: Trelawney's sacking in the courtyard, Hagrid dragged away under cover of darkness, McGonagall felled by a barrage of stunning spells. These were not acts of law but of theatre, designed to warn the rest of the institution what resistance would cost. The progression was unmistakable. First, words on paper, then proceedings dressed up as law, then the raid itself. Each step louder, more visible, more punishing. Each step confirming in Trump's mind that the army he feared was real and gathering strength. This is how Comey's army ceased to be rumor and became operational in the imagination of power. Not because prosecutors were plotting in secret, but because power needed them to be. Every spectacle, every raid, every announcement served as proof that the phantom enemy was alive and must be fought. At the Ministry of Magic, this was the moment when denial gave way to aggression, no longer insisting Voldemort had not returned, but insisting that Dumbledore's plot had. In Washington, the same pivot unfolded. The Phantom Army, once whispered, was now shouted from the podium, and the louder it was shouted, the more it demanded a commander to blame. The shadow had lengthened for months, but September brought the storm. By its end, the imagined enemy, Comey's army, no longer lived only in rumor or accusation. It stood, made real in the indictments and declarations of the president himself. This was the siege of law, of speech, of the very idea of independence. On September 4th, the Department of Justice opened a criminal probe into Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, sending subpoenas from Georgia to Michigan. Mortgage fraud prosecutions of this kind are vanishingly rare, yet suddenly they multiplied. James, Schiff, Cook. Each referral from the Federal Housing Finance Agency was treated as gospel, converted into criminal pursuit. It was the logic of decrees at the Ministry of Magic, one rule after another, stretched beyond sense, written only to ensnare. Anything independent became suspect. If Letitia James was a foe, then surely Lisa Cook was as well. Paranoia metastasized into policy. By September 9th, Reuters noted the obvious. These prosecutions were extraordinary in rarity and so conspicuous in their selectivity. But that only underscored the point. Spectacle, not substance, was the aim. On September 10th, the Inspector General reported dangerous shortages and neglect at FDC CTAC, a reminder that oversight still spoke truth even as its voice was muted. That same day, activist Charlie Kirk was assassinated in Utah, and his death became pretext. Within days, Attorney General Bondi floated hate speech prosecutions against those who trivialized the killing. She later narrowed the scope, but the message had been sent. Speech itself was now under review. Meanwhile, affidavits from the August raid on John Bolton were unsealed, confirming the seizure of classified documents, yet yielding no charges. A show of force without resolution, like the ministry's raids against Hagrid or Trelawney's public sacking. The point was humiliation, not outcome. The silencing spread from courts to culture. On September 17th, Jimmy Kimmel Live was suspended after his monologue on Kirk's murder. FCC pressure followed, and some networks refused to carry the show when it returned. It was the Quibbler all over again. The popular voice branded subversive, banished from circulation. Then came another resignation. On September 19th, U.S. Attorney Eric Siebert quit under pressure to prosecute Letitia James without evidence. The next day, the president claimed he had fired him. The truth mattered less than the performance. A respected prosecutor turned into a cautionary tale, a name rewritten as disloyal. By September 21st, Senator Chris Murphy warned openly that Trump was locking up, taking down off the air all of his political enemies. Majority Leader Schumer echoed him, calling it dictatorship. And on September 22nd, the president signed an executive order designating Antifa a domestic terrorist organization, effectively criminalizing dissent itself. That same day, news broke of a new criminal probe into Representative Adam Schiff. The ministry's logic had returned. If resistance could not be silenced, then it must be outlawed. On September 24th, a federal judge ruled that January's Inspector General purge was unlawful. The decision offered clarity, but little remedy. Oversight remained gutted, a truth recorded, but not restored. The next day, the storm broke. On September 25th, a federal grand jury indicted James Comey for false statements and obstruction of Congress tied to his 2020 testimony. Hours later, President Trump cheered the charges and promised there will be others. The phantom army he had feared was now given its general. The prophecy he had imagined was fulfilled by his own hand, and he did not stop there. That same day, a presidential memorandum declared left-leaning non-profits and donors to be agitators, warning of investigations to come. On September 26th, Trump made good on the threat, promising prosecutions of James, Schiff, Cook, the next names already chosen. The logic was Voldemort's at the ministry. Having denied the enemy for months, power finally announced it as fact. The army existed, said the decrees, and its commander was Comey. The legend that had lived only as accusation was now made flesh in indictment. Selective prosecutions, criminalization of speech, suppression of media, spectacle raids and sham hearings, judicial pushback that recorded truth but could not restore it, and finally, the naming of an enemy commander. This is the loop completed. Suspicion bred purges, purges bred resistance. Resistance was reimagined as conspiracy, and conspiracy was punished as truth. In September 2025, paranoia ceased to be a whisper and became policy. Comey's army, once a shadow in the mind of power, was conjured into being by the very attempt to destroy it. But what does it mean for a phantom to be made real? It means the character of opposition itself changes. At the start of the year, resistance was principled and visible. Prosecutors resigning with letters of conscience, judges writing opinions that demanded evidence, whistleblowers citing statute and oath. It was open, legal, and painstakingly honest. But once those acts were branded as conspiracy, once their authors were punished as traitors, resistance lost the safety of daylight. What remains in the open is only what can be controlled. What is pushed underground grows darker, less predictable, more dangerous. The attempt to banish independence transforms it. From resignation letters and lawful disclosures, resistance turns into encrypted forums and back channels. From orderly casework, it becomes improvisation and evasion. From professional memory, it becomes folklore whispered in exile. And in every domain where Trump sought control, he created the very threat he feared. In prosecutions, by demanding charges against political rivals, he ensured that dismissals and refusals would look like coordinated subversion. In speech, by criminalizing dissent and threatening hate speech cases, he guaranteed that criticism would migrate from public debate into satire, coded language, and underground media. In oversight, by purging inspectors general and intimidating watchdogs, he made every surviving report read like contraband, more potent precisely because it was suppressed. In culture, by silencing comedians and critics, he elevated them as symbols, their absence proof that the truth was being strangled. In each case, control did not neutralize resistance, it radicalized it. The imagination of conspiracy, once acted upon, created the very shape it feared. This is the paradox of authoritarian power. In trying to erase opposition, it makes opposition inevitable and more dangerous. Voldemort imagined Dumbledore's army into existence. Trump imagined Comey's. Both were born not in the minds of their founders, but in the fears of their enemies. And so the legend closes where it began, with paranoia. A cycle in which suspicion feeds repression, repression feeds resistance, and resistance is recast as the proof of suspicion. The army that began as illusion ends as reality, not because it was plotted in secret rooms, but because it was conjured by decree,